Okay, everybody, welcome back to video 3 of chapter 10, consideration. Just to recap a little bit, real quick, of last section of consideration. We talked about agreements that lack consideration and are therefore unenforceable. Promises to make a gift, that's how the law says it, to make a gift, but promises to give a gift to somebody does not offer valid consideration and not enforceable. Promises to obey the law. Everybody has to obey the law, and therefore promises to do so lack consideration. A pre-existing duty. So, for example, if a police officer is on duty and you say, "I'll pay you $1,000 if you go arrest that guy because I think he broke into my house," but he has a duty to do that already, so that lacks consideration. An illusory promise. Okay, that's looks like there may be consideration, but one of the parties isn't really bound to do anything, right? They might not do anything, so that's illusory. And the last one, promises to attend a social engagement, to go to a party, to go to a prom, or to go on a date, or things like that. Lack consideration. If somebody does a no-show, there's no lawsuit. This next section talks about special things that come up, certain situations that come up that may or may not offer valid consideration. And let's talk about this first one, which is called partial payment of a debt. Right? Promising to do something you are already legally bound to do is not binding. Like promising to pay what's left of an existing debt, you're already legally bound to pay that money. So let's look at a couple of situations here. We'll get back to that definition in a second, but let's look at this situation just so we have better clarification and understanding at first. Terry owes Scott $500. The balance is past due. Scott agrees to accept $250 as payment in full, but later sues Terry for the additional $250 owed under the original contract. Now it's that original contract which offered the consideration, so that's the contract that is binding. Right? So Terry can sue. He said, "Yeah, give me $250. Listen, you're past due. You owed me it last week. Give me $250. We'll call it even." Right? Well, Terry changes his mind and says, "Well, no, I want my other $250. Well, he's going to win in court because partial payments of a debt don't offer valid consideration. Right? The original agreement offered valid consideration. There's no other obligation here. Right? Terry doesn't get his full benefit. Right? So each promise made as consideration for another promise must create a new obligation, right? Here's a different scenario. However, I'm going to press this button and see what happens here. Shoot. Okay, say Scott's hurting for cash. Right? Scott's hurting for cash in this scenario. So he calls Terry and says, "Listen, I know the balance of your $500 isn't due until the end of the month. You don't owe it to me yet. But listen, I'm hurting for cash, and if you pay me early, I'll only charge you $250 and we'll call it even." Well, that paying it early offers a new obligation. Right? So in this situation, there is valid consideration, and $250 is all that he'll have to pay. In the other situation, because it was past due, he has to pay the full amount. But if he pays early, all right, as a request from Scott, who's hurting for cash, all right, then because he has to pay early, you see the difference here. It offers a different obligation, so therefore consideration is valid. This happens sometimes in settlement of disputed claims. This is why when you go and have work done on your car now, they'll call you before they do the work and say, yeah, listen, you need a whole new muffler system with labor and parts. It's going to be $450. In the past, they might have said, yeah, drop it off. We'll take a look. All right. And then they do the work. And then they call you and say, yeah, it was $500. You'd be like, wait a minute, $500? How much did you charge me for labor? How much did you charge me for parts? How much, for the time? What's going on here? Well, so there was a lot of disputed claims. So that's why this comes up in the law now. So say Terry insists that $500 is too high a price for the work performed by Scott. Terry maintains the service to be Terry thinks the service was worth $250. Scott agrees and compromises at $350 as payment in full. All right? So here, there's valid consideration. It's a compromise. Right? Sometimes, just a little thing here, if you bring your car in for repairs, the bill you receive for service is more than you think is reasonable, you can send the amount of money into the shop you think is reasonable and write on the check, in full payment of the amount I owe. You can't see that down there. In full payment of the amount I owe, and that would cover the entire charge if they cash your check. But to eliminate these things, that's why they call you now and tell you that how much exactly it's going to be before they do the work. They should anyways. If they don't, then you go find a different garage to do your work. Time extensions. All right, we talked a little bit about time extensions in the partial payment, but or we talked about paying early in the partial payment, but time extensions. There's no consideration for the promise of a time extension. So for this company, the company XYZ borrowed $100,000 from the Bank of Greed. The Bank of Greed agreed to extend the time of payment for 30 days. However, the next day, the bank rescinds their promise and sues the company for the $100,000 they want then. All right? The thing is, the promise of a time extension does not offer valid consideration, and they can bring a lawsuit. It would be a crappy thing to do, but time extensions don't offer valid consideration. Some promises are enforceable without consideration. Right? And there's a couple, these are special circumstances where there's no consideration, but it's still valid. All right? If you pledge money to a nonprofit or something like that, all right, that may be enforceable. All right? If you tell the American Red Cross you're going to, pledge to them $500, they may be able to enforce that. All right? The courts try to enforce these pledges to nonprofits and charitable organizations because that's how they work. That's how they run. And most of these nonprofit organizations and charitable organizations are in the public's best interest that we have them. So if you promise them money, even though you may not be receiving a benefit, you don't need, there's no consideration that's needed for this to be valid. Right? So here's an example, right? Mary pledges to donate $10 million to the University of Florida. Right? The university begins construction of a new building. Mary takes her pledge back. She can't do that. All right? She can't do that because pledges, promises to non-charitable, to charitable organizations and nonprofit groups are binding. So you be careful when you do those things. There's actually a name for this. It's called the doctrine of promissory estoppel. Right? The doctrine of promissory estoppel. It's the only doctrine we talk about. So when you see a doctrine in the test, this is what it is: doctrine of promissory estoppel. Um, that means you can't get out of to prevent the injustice of one person's changing. So when Mary pledges the $10 million, right? It changes. The people change, the university changes what they do. Maybe they hire contractors, they go through planning, they do everything, they break ground, they start building a new library, whatever the case may be, right? They've changed their position significantly. Mary then can't change her mind and take back the $10 million. Here's another example. Say you have a wealthy aunt or uncle or something like that, and you weren't planning on going to college. And the aunt and uncle pulls you aside and says, listen, you go to college, don't worry about the costs. I'll pay back 75% of any of the costs that you incur. Books, tuition, rent, whatever the case may be. And you do it. Right? And then after you're done with the college, you say, listen, Aunt, you promised this. And she's like, oh, I can't do that. It's not, I can't do that now. I didn't mean it or whatever. No, it's enforceable because you changed your position in your life significantly based on their promise. So the doctrine of promissory estoppel will force them into fulfilling their obligation to you, right? And so 3 conditions have to be met for the doctrine of promissory estoppel. The promise must be made to brought about an action. I wasn't going to college until my rich aunt offered to pay for 75% of it. All right? So she offered to pay for 75% of it. I went. All right? The person who gave no consideration must have relied on the promise and changed his or her position in life. Yeah, I relied on the promise. Right? I relied on the promise. Without it, I wasn't going. I changed my position in life significantly by taking on all this debt. Right? And the injustice can only be avoided by enforcing the contract. It would be a terrible injustice if somebody offered a promise like that, and then reneged on it, took it back, just didn't, no longer would fulfill their obligation. Right? This is where the doctrine of promissory estoppel comes in. Right? And it's the only doctrine we talk about. And that's it for this chapter. All right, so look next week for the chapter test. I hope you're all doing great, and I hope to see you soon.